In European history, there was a torture method so horrifying and excruciating that it made people wish they were dead. Compared to this, being torn apart by 5 horses, being cut into thousands of pieces, or even lynching were just child's play. It was the most famous torture method in medieval Europe, known as the water drop torture. You heard it right. Even tiny water drops could make people beg for death but be unable to die. The water drop torture involves slowly dripping water onto a person's forehead. The cold water and the anxiety of not knowing when the next drop would come could bring immense psychological terror to the victim. After some time, due to the erosive nature of water, a hollow wound would form on the person's forehead, ultimately leading to the victim's psychological breakdown, mental derangement, and death. In the Viking legend, this cruel water drop torture was eventually inflicted upon Floki. After the bloody raid on Paris, Ragnar and his subordinates returned to the Kattegat Strait. However, due to being severely wounded in battle, Ragnar remained in a deep coma, and Bjorn exercised the power of the king on his behalf. After distributing the acquired gold, silver, and treasures to the people, Bjorn held a grand assembly halfway up the mountain. Indeed, a tiger father does not beget a dog son. Despite his young age, Bjorn already displayed a kingly demeanor that was not inferior to his father's. He first praised his father's benevolence and then began to commend Athelstan, saying that all of this was made possible because of Athelstan's guidance. Paris was indeed as magnificent and splendid as Athelstan had described. Floki, the murderer who killed Athelstan, was captured by Bjorn. Floki tried to defend himself, saying that he killed Athelstan because Athelstan believed in Christianity and that he did so under the guidance of the gods. But at this moment, all of Floki's defenses seemed feeble and powerless. Just like that, Floki was chained up in the square like a dog, enduring people's contempt. Fortunately, his wife Helga brought him food every day and remained loyal to Floki. On the other hand, seeing Ragnar's condition deteriorating day by day, a slog couldn't wait to find the seer. She wanted to ask if she could replace Ragnar as the queen of the Vikings after his death.
Yes, I have seen it. A woman will one day rule in Kattegat.
Will it be me?
The seer did not directly answer yes or no, but this undoubtedly gave the slog some confidence. However, she celebrated too early. As soon as she returned home, her second son told her the news of Ragnar waking up.
Well, don't you care? Of course I do. Go and tell everyone that Ragnar the king lives.
At the same time, Helga also informed Floki about Ragnar's awakening, which made Floki think about escaping because Ragnar would certainly kill him once he woke up. In the evening, a slog hypocritically held a grand banquet to celebrate Ragnar's awakening. At the dinner table, a black-haired, yellow-skinned servant caught Ragnar's attention. A slog told Ragnar that this was a slave she bought from the slave market, named Idu. If he liked her, he could enjoy her at will, and she wouldn't mind. Ragnar did not respond. When he learned that Bjorn had privately arrested Floki, his face instantly changed. In his view, Bjorn was forcing him to make a decision. After all, Floki was a good friend who had brought him honor, and Floki had even saved him before. Originally, he could have thought about how to handle this matter, but now he was truly in a dilemma. At the same time, Ragnar also criticized his son for not leaving Rollo in Paris because he knew his brother's nature too well.
He is my uncle.
He is my brother. And I know better.
Sure enough, just as Ragnar had predicted, Rollo had already been recruited by King Charles. The king not only bestowed Rollo with a title and land but also married his daughter to him. The wedding was held amidst Gisla's tears, but in the end, the arm couldn't resist the thigh, and she was sent to the bridal chamber. To win his father-in-law's trust, Rollo personally led the Parisian soldiers to wipe out the Viking warriors who remained in Paris. From that moment on, Rollo officially betrayed Ragnar and became an enemy of the Vikings.
Ragnar will revenge us.
On the Vikings' side, Ragnar's accusations made Bjorn consider leaving. He wanted to prove that he could make a name for himself on his own. The father thought the son was incapable, and the son wanted to prove himself to the father. All fathers and sons are like this. Although reluctant, Ragnar ultimately respected his son's decision. After Bjorn left, Ragnar got up and walked towards Floki.
Are you going to kill me?
You betrayed me. You betrayed my trust and my love for you.
Stop hiding behind the gods.
You killed Ethelstan out of jealousy. That is the truth. Just admit it.
No. The truth is, I did as the gods commanded. And I would do it again if they willed it.
Ragnar originally wanted Floki to voluntarily admit his mistake and then conveniently release him, but Floki's response was undoubtedly a challenge to Ragnar's authority. So, the angry Ragnar decided to give Floki a creative punishment to make Floki experience pain he had never experienced before. Floki wanted a tragic death so that he could enter Valhalla and drink and talk with the gods, but Ragnar did not give him this opportunity. This creative punishment was neither tragic nor could it move the gods. It would torture Floki forever and ever. Ragnar hung Floki in a cave, letting him endure the torment of the water drop torture. The water drops from the rock crevices fell one by one onto Floki's head. At first, Floki thought it was nothing, but after a few hours, he felt a deep sense of fear and unease. With each drop of water, this fear and oppression intensified, especially when the water drops fell irregularly. Floki always anticipated the arrival of the next drop. If the interval between drops was slightly longer, it would make him anxious and uneasy. After a few days, the long-term inability to sleep and the tense emotions made Floki's mind start to go crazy. More crucially, the principle of water dripping through stone had already caused a hollow wound on Floki's scalp. But fortunately, Floki still had a good wife who was devoted to him. Helga held a bowl over Floki's head to catch the water, in order to alleviate his suffering and let him sleep for a while. When pouring water, Helga fell asleep due to extreme fatigue. It's not hard to imagine how much Floki suffered from this mental torment. He wanted his wife to kill him to end this inhuman torture, but how could Helga bear to do it? One day, a week later, Ragnar had a dream. He dreamed that Athelstan kept telling him in his ear to be merciful.
Mercy. Mercy. Mercy.
In the end, Ragnar went to the cave and released Floki. This time, the terrible torture made Floki determined to betray Ragnar. Not long ago, a slog bought a black-eyed, yellow-skinned slave at the slave market. Ragnar was unusually curious about this Asian girl, and a slog noticed this. At night, when they were going to sleep, a slog asked Ragnar if he had taken a liking to Idu, and if so, she wouldn't mind. Ragnar did not respond. From then on, this girl named Idu became Ragnar's personal female slave. When preparing bath water for Ragnar, Idu clumsily carried a bucket of water up and splashed it on Ragnar's face. But Ragnar didn't get angry. Instead, he was attracted by Idu's clumsiness. The next day, Ragnar saw the clumsy Idu struggling with a pig, which made Ragnar feel that this girl definitely did not come from a poor family. Otherwise, she wouldn't be unable to do even the most basic farm work. So, Ragnar curiously went over to ask about Idu's background. Idu told Ragnar that when she and her family were sailing at sea, they encountered pirates. The pirates killed some of them, and those who survived became slaves and were sold here. She also had a brother whose fate was unknown. At this point, Idu began to choke up, but she did not reveal her identity because, for a slave who had lost their freedom, their past no longer had any meaning. Idu's personality made Ragnar like her very much and also made him feel pity for this poor girl. He saw the shadow of Athelstan in Idu. Ragnar took Idu to his secret base, a small wooden house where no one else had been before. He kept many cute little animals there. I have to say, Ragnar's taste was really heavy. He kept pets like snakes, insects, rats, and ants inside. Ragnar told Idu that from now on, she could freely enter and exit this place and no longer had to do the work of a slave. As they gradually became familiar with each other, Idu let Ragnar experience an ancient herbal medicine from the mysterious East. Out of curiosity, Ragnar tried this thing for the first time. After taking the herbal medicine, Ragnar immediately felt like the whole world was floating. and he had a feeling of riding on clouds and mist. What he didn't know was that this was something similar to opium. From then on, Ragnar was completely controlled by this thing and couldn't break free. On the other hand, since the Battle of Paris, Lagertha had returned to her own territory. Because Kaf had saved Lagertha's life in Paris, Lagertha's attitude towards Kaf had slightly eased. To win Lagertha's affection, Kaf publicly announced that he planned to rule this place together with Lagertha, with equal status. Everyone expressed support for Kaf's decision, but there was one person who couldn't be happy no matter what. This person was Einar, who had previously peeped at Lagertha while she was taking a bath and held a grudge. Einar approached Kaf and expressed his dissatisfaction. He claimed that it was all thanks to his support that Kaf became the Earl. He demanded that Kaf get rid of Lagertha, or else he would make it impossible for Kaf to stay. Kaf indicated that he knew what to do. Later, Kaf gathered many people on the hillside for a council meeting. He directly negated his previous decision, stating that he would expel Lagertha. Hearing this, Lagertha's heart completely sank to the bottom. However, Kaf also stated that for the sake of fairness, they would have a public vote. Those who hoped to expel Lagertha should leave a mark on the pillar in the middle. Einar was the first to rush up and leave a scratch, and he also instigated his own people to come and vote. After the voting was completed, indeed, those who hoped to expel Lagertha were in the majority, and these people were all Einar's supporters. Einar immediately reported the voting results to Kaf. Kaf also stated that he had already made a choice. Then, with a wave of his hand, he promptly killed all those who supported Einar. Lagertha was moved. She cast an admiring glance at Kaf. When Erlender was about to send Einar away, Lagertha stopped him. She wanted to let Einar know that this was the consequence of peeping at her while she was taking a bath.
I should have done this a long time ago, Einar.
This was not the most ruthless part. When you see Lagertha's next set of actions, you will definitely have a new understanding of this Viking's first shield maiden. After quelling Einar's rebellion, Lagertha's attitude towards Kaf underwent a 180-degree change. They put aside their prejudices and slept in the same bed again. Kaf struck while the iron was hot. Using flowery words, he said that he had always thought he wanted power, but in the end, he realized that what he wanted more was still Lagertha. Lagertha stared blankly at this man who had once taken away her territory. No one knew what she was thinking at that moment, but in the end, Lagertha still willingly gave herself to Kaf. In the days that followed, they were inseparable like glue, and Lagertha naturally became pregnant with Kaf's child. Upon learning this good news, Kaf happily proposed to Lagertha.
Say that you'll marry me.
A month later, the wedding took place as planned, and the outside was filled with Viking warriors congratulating the couple. Inside the room, Lagertha was dressed in green, wearing a wreath on her head. With a smile, she exuded charm. I have to say, Lagertha was indeed beautiful. Even though she was already a grandmother, there were no traces of the years on her face. But suddenly, Lagertha, who was all smiles and leaning on Kaf in the previous second, pulled out a knife in the next second and directly stabbed it into Kaf's body. At this time, the clan outside was still in an atmosphere of joy. It was not until Lagertha walked out alone, covered in blood, and announced that she was the only legitimate earl of this land.
Your calf is dead.
Long live Earl Ingstad! Long live Earl Ingstad! Long live Earl Ingstad! Long live Earl Ingstad!
Since her ex-husband Ragnar's infidelity, Lagertha no longer believed in love. In her heart, only the power in her hands gave her a sense of security. Erlender was puzzled as to why Lagertha had to kill Kaf, as they were already managing this place together on equal terms. To this, Lagertha responded as follows.
I made a promise. I promised I'd kill him for taking my earldom.
With Kaf dead, Lagertha asked Erlender whether he would leave this place or follow her. Erlender ultimately chose to stay by Lagertha's side because he wanted to go to Paris with Ragnar to plunder. In the blink of an eye, spring arrived. and various groups of people gathered at the Kattegat Strait, ready to attack Paris again. The man with a face full of tattoos was named Harold, who was also an earl of other Viking tribes. Bjorn had experienced half a year of outdoor life, and now he had also returned to the Kattegat Strait. Harold told Bjorn, "I am only the vanguard. My brother Halfdan is leading the main force and has already set off. He will soon join me, and we will follow Ragnar to Paris to raid." Before long, Halfdan arrived at the Kattegat Strait with their fleet. They eagerly asked Ragnar when they would attack Paris, as they were already impatient to slaughter the Christians. Ragnar told them that once they reached Paris, they would have plenty of opportunities. I don't know if anyone noticed Ragnar's red lips. By now, he had been completely controlled by Idu's opium and couldn't break free. At night, the Vikings gathered together again to eat and drink, and the room was filled with joy. However, two lonely souls were lying on the roof, pouring out their hearts to each other. Perhaps it was because of the opium, but Ragnar told Idu that he was tired of fighting and killing. He also told Idu about the massacre of his people who had stayed in England.
A few years ago, I established a settlement in a distant country where I took many of my people and friends to make a new life for themselves. But shortly after my departure, they were all slaughtered, their homes destroyed and burned. I live with such guilt because of it.
Seeing Ragnar's sincerity, Idu also revealed her own background.
My father's the emperor.
The next day, Ragnar announced that they would set off for Paris in 3 weeks. Everyone cheered and rejoiced, finally waiting for the day of battle. Before setting off, Ragnar found Idu, wanting more opium. By now, he had been completely controlled by this substance and couldn't break free, but Idu said that she couldn't give him too much, or else he wouldn't be able to control himself. She could go to Paris with him, and she could also speak French. Ragnar agreed without thinking because he really needed a translator. 3 weeks later, accompanied by the song of the Vikings expedition, more than 100 warships slowly sailed out of the Kattegat Strait. Officially heading towards Paris, they tied a captive to a wooden board and let him drift with the sea. The two sons asked Ragnar in confusion about the purpose of doing this. Ragnar told them he was using a peculiar method to find the over 100 lost warships and over 3,000 warriors in the vast ocean. Just a few days ago, Ragnar had gathered over 100 warships, preparing to attack Paris, but the heavens are unpredictable. A storm completely disrupted their plans. The next day, when everyone woke up, they found only one ship floating alone on the sea. At this moment, Ragnar wanted to die. He stared blankly at the sunstone and sundial in his hand. Now, only the things in his hands could guide the direction to reach Paris. If the remaining ships couldn't find him, it meant those few thousand warriors might be lost in the vast ocean. After much thought, Ragnar decided to first sail into the Seine river and go ashore, then think of other methods. Fortunately, just as they were about to land, 2 more ships found Ragnar, and they also discovered a small group of Parisian sentries on the shore. A group quietly landed and easily took care of the Parisian sentries in the forest by the riverbank, establishing a camp there, but the Vikings didn't notice there was still one that slipped through the net. At the same time, to find the lost ships, Ragnar ordered a captive to be tied to a wooden board. The two sons asked him the purpose of doing this. Ragnar told them the Seine river was upstream of the ocean, so this captive would ultimately flow into the sea, and once the lost ships at sea discovered him, he would guide them to the direction of the Seine. Before long, they saw a beacon lit on the distant mountain. This meant the news of the Vikings' landing had already reached Paris. Ragnar knew the situation was dire. Now they only had a few hundred people. If the Parisians came to kill them, they would surely die. But at the moment, they had no way out. This completely angered the short-tempered Harold brothers. They grabbed the Parisian captives and directly tied them to the beacon and lit it. Floki also participated. At this time, Floki had already hit it off with the Harold brothers. After the water drop torture, Floki only had utter hatred for Ragnar, and the Harold brothers' devotion to the gods was very much to Floki's taste.
So now we've sent another signal to Paris! A signal from the gods! Do you think they can see it? Do you think they can understand it?
Inside the city of Paris, Charles, who knew the Vikings had come to attack again, was already scared out of his wits. He wept and begged Rollo, hoping he would help him fight the Vikings for the princess's sake. After all, only he was most familiar with the Vikings' tactics.
I will not betray you. I will not betray Paris, and I will not betray my wife.
Rollo's stance finally made Gisela have a good impression of this barbarian. Afterwards, Rollo found Odo and began to discuss countermeasures. Rollo suggested setting up fortress towers on both banks of the Seine River to prevent the Vikings from sailing directly to the city. Odo finally understood Rollo's meaning. This move of stringing iron chains across the river was indeed ingenious. At the same time, the drifting captive shouted himself hoarse in the ocean. The lost Viking ships finally found him. With this captive's guidance, more Viking warships entered the Seine River. After gathering these ships, the Vikings continued to advance towards Paris. On the way, Ragnar asked Idu for a mouthful of opium. Afterwards, Ragnar began to hallucinate. He seemed to see Lagertha, Gaida, and young Bjorn from a few years ago by the river. At that time, Ragnar was not an earl, not a king, he was just an ordinary farmer, but every one of their faces was filled with happy smiles. Although he had gained power now, he had forever lost that feeling from back then. Coming back to his senses, Ragnar saw a person he couldn't be more familiar with. Rollo. Rollo, now a duke, rode a tall horse, dressed in noble attire, with Parisian soldiers following behind him. Ragnar was furious. He kicked Bjorn, who had just been defending his uncle not long ago. Awake, Bjorn was unwilling to believe what was before his eyes, but whether he believed it or not, the current Rollo had already become the Vikings' enemy. Seeing the fortress towers established ahead, Ragnar ordered the entire army to set up camp on the riverbank. For this battle, Ragnar planned it like this: we'll send a squad to approach the fortress from the land. The death squad will attract the enemy's arrows and the rest of the ships will try to force their way through the fortress. This plan received unanimous approval from everyone. Lagertha also volunteered to lead the small land team to harass the fortress. Knowing Lagertha was already pregnant, Ragnar very much didn't want her to take the risk. After the meeting ended, Ragnar found Lagertha and told her not to take the risk, but Lagertha said, "What am I to you? If you have time, pay more attention to your current wife."
Father, can we fight with you tomorrow? Please.
You're not strong enough yet, boys. I want you to stay here. I want you to protect all the food and the supplies. Can you do that for me?
Yes, Father.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Ragnar left the old, weak, sick, and disabled in the camp, then took the elite troops and officially set off towards the fortress. The Herald brothers were raring to go. They couldn't wait to slaughter the Christians. On the watchtower, Rollo was confident, quietly waiting for the warships to arrive. But he didn't notice that at this time, Lagertha's small team was quietly approaching the fortress. But as they walked, Lagertha discovered something was wrong. It turned out this was a swamp. Rollo had long anticipated Ragnar would attack from land, so he built the watchtower beside this swamp. The huge sound attracted Rollo's attention. When all the Vikings were stuck in the swamp, Rollo immediately ordered them to shoot arrows. Because they were deeply trapped, many Vikings were hit and fell before they could dodge. Ragnar ordered the warships to advance towards the fortress at full speed. The Parisian soldiers on the watchtower had to fight on two fronts. This brought Lagertha a brief respite. She led the remaining team members and struggled out of the swamp. But as Lagertha's team was advancing, a squad of Parisian soldiers wielding crossbows suddenly rushed out from the woods behind. Attacked from both sides, Lagertha had no choice but to lead the remnants of the troops to flee in panic. At the same time, over 100 warships had already sailed into the fortress. However, Rollo just lightly waved his hand. and a huge iron chain stretched across the middle of the Seine River, instantly overturning countless warships that were speeding over. Seeing a huge chain stretching across the middle of the Seine River, Ragnar immediately ordered the ships to turn around, but it was all too late, because the speed of the ships was simply too fast. The iron chain directly overturned several warships. If it were just this, then you would be underestimating Rollo. He ordered the Parisian soldiers on the shore to bring out catapults, but strangely, what the catapults launched weren't stones, but bags of liquid.
Up until the overturned keel, clamber with a heart of steel. Cold is the ocean spring, and your death is on its way.
An arrow was shot at the capsized ships. The fuel met fire and burned fiercely. In an instant, the entire sea was filled with the heart-wrenching wails of the Vikings. Faced with the burning warships, the Vikings desperately swam towards the ships behind that weren't on fire. Some were saved, but more people forever remained in the Seine River. In the chaos, Ragnar saw Floki struggling desperately. Ragnar was frozen in place. He didn't know whether to save a man who had betrayed him or not. Suddenly, a hand pulled Floki out. The one who saved him was none other than Ragnar, whom Floki deeply hated. Bjorn used a rope to pull them back onto the ship. Only at this moment did Floki understand who his true brother was in times of crisis. Seeing his men dead and wounded, Ragnar was overcome with grief and anger. He staggered to his feet and began to curse his traitorous brother Rollo.
This is how you repay my love!
You had me, brother.
Go away! Come on!
Rollo had once said he had always lived in Ragnar's shadow. Outside, it was pitch black and he couldn't see any light at all. But now, Princess Gisela had become the light of his life. To gain power and glory, Rollo could betray everything, of course including his people and elder brother. After another defeat, Ragnar could only lead the remaining troops back to camp, but as soon as they landed, everyone was stunned by what they saw before them. It turned out that while they were fiercely fighting on the Seine River, their camp had also been attacked by Parisian soldiers. Not only did they kill all the elderly, weak, women and children left here, they also burned all the Vikings' grain and grass. It must be said, Rollo's scheme was indeed brilliant. Floki searched everywhere for his wife's figure. Not far away, he found Helga severely burned and on the verge of death. Fortunately, Ragnar's 2 children and Idu hid in the woods and escaped disaster. After cremating the warriors' corpses, Ragnar stared blankly at the camp that had been burned beyond recognition. Grief-stricken, Ragnar really couldn't bear the pressure. He found Idu and asked for more leaves. Not long after, Bjorn found Ragnar and asked him how they should fight next. The longer the time, the more prepared the Parisians would be. But Ragnar said,
Tell them tomorrow that we go back downriver.
Are you alright?
Just tell them tomorrow we retreat!
It is evident here that after eating this opium-like leaf, Ragnar became cowardly. He had developed a fear of war. The next day, the Vikings began the return journey. The troops were all very dissatisfied with Ragnar's weakness. The Vikings could be defeated in battle, but they couldn't accept returning empty-handed. The Harald brothers felt Ragnar was merely a paper tiger. Could such a cowardly person still be a legendary figure of the Vikings? Faced with everyone's doubts, Ragnar remained silent until they passed a cliff. A nearly crazy plan to defeat the enemy suddenly flashed through Ragnar's mind.
Bien.
What?
Tell everyone. We're going to make camp here.
Ragnar suddenly told Bjorn to stop the ship and announced they would set up camp on top of the cliff. Harald was very puzzled. There were many places to camp, so why choose a place like a cliff? Ragnar explained to everyone. On the way back, I carefully observed that the Seine River is a river that flows around mountains. We can let the warships climb the cliff and then cross the mountains to go upstream of the fortress. The Parisians absolutely won't imagine such an ingenious method, and they won't have time to build a new fortress now. Then we can directly attack the city of Paris and catch them off guard. Everyone thought Ragnar's head must have gone bad. This idea sounded not bad, but each ship weighed over a dozen tons, so how could hundreds of warships fly up the cliff, cross the forest, and fall into the river upstream? Ragnar looked at Floki with full confidence. He believed this genius Floki would definitely be able to do it.
No. I can do it, Ragnar. I can do it for you.
Being used by Ragnar again, Floki was overjoyed. So next was how to accomplish Ragnar's great vision. The first step was to empty the equipment on the ships, which would make them easier to hoist. Then, it was to use the latest device developed by Floki to pull the warships up bit by bit. I wonder if everyone noticed that this wooden thing looked exactly like a crane of today, and there were even 2 iron pulleys at the top of the fulcrum. It must be said, Floki's inventive ability was indeed at its peak. Seeing the warships being hoisted up the cliff one by one, Harold was full of admiration for Ragnar. Only then did he realize why Ragnar was called the Legend of the Vikings. But obviously, Ragnar had no mind to listen to and flatter him here. At this moment, his drug addiction was acting up again. Ragnar hurriedly found Idu, wanting more leaves, but Idu said she had none left.
You're lying again. The only reason I wanted you to come was because of the medicine.
This made Idu heartbroken. She treated Ragnar with all her heart, but in the end, she wasn't even as important as a small leaf. Idu leaves in anger and threatens to make public the secret of the massacre of the Viking settlement in England. You should know, the last person who knew this secret had already been smothered by Ragnar. How could he let Idu off? Ragnar suddenly turned around and pressed Idu dead in the water. Finally, Idu stopped breathing. Ragnar took out the last bit of opium from her pocket, but when he turned around, he found his 2 sons staring at him trembling. Ragnar went up and told them not to tell anyone. Then he made an excuse to send the sons away and finally returned to the water to push Idu's corpse into the corner. At the same time, most of the ships had been hoisted ashore. Floki was still laying logs on the ground to serve as a road base to make towing easier. Floki even specially arranged for people to apply grease on the logs to reduce friction, but while the Vikings were trekking through the mountains, a pair of Frankish farmers discovered them, but they didn't realize the seriousness of the problem and chose to ignore it. They just silently prayed these Vikings wouldn't discover their farm. Speak of the devil, in the blink of an eye, the Harald brothers brought their men to their farm. They went in and looted valuables everywhere. A bouquet of flowers on the table caught Harold's attention.
There are women here.
Soon, they found the villagers hiding in the hayloft of the cowshed, of course including the farmer's 2 daughters. After a bout of humiliation, they ransacked the small farm, leaving only a house of corpses and walls of blood. Although they left one alive, the person's eyes were cruelly gouged out. After several days of effort, the Vikings trekked dozens of miles through the mountains and finally arrived upstream of the fortress. Across the river, everyone could clearly see the city of Paris within reach. Just as everyone was cheering, Ragnar couldn't be happy at all, because there was only 1 leaf left in his pocket. Ragnar decided to save it for the great battle, because only then could he muster the energy to fight. Ragnar found Floki and told him to build an unprecedented arrow ship according to his vision. During the preparations, due to the lack of leaves, Ragnar's mental state became worse and worse, and all of this was seen by his son Bjorn.
It's what Idu gave you, isn't it?
She told me it was medicine. Now I feel poisoned without it.
Then take some more.
I only have a little bit left. I have to save it to fight Rollo.
A few days later, all the ships had completely fallen into the river. It turned out that what Ragnar had Floki build was this platform that looked like an aircraft carrier. This way, it would be more convenient for them to fight at sea. With preparations complete, the crowd grandly advanced towards Paris. At this time, Rollo wasn't idle either. After learning from the villager whose eyes were gouged out that the Vikings had crossed the mountains, Rollo ordered people to build warships day and night. He decided to have a decisive battle with Ragnar on the river. This was the largest scale naval battle to date. You can't imagine that in Europe 1,200 years ago, the clever Vikings had already developed a prototype of an aircraft carrier. This mini-carrier was made of wooden barrels and fences, driven by the manpower of 3 warships rowing. Each carrier was fully loaded with Viking warriors and siege equipment. A total of 5,000 Viking warriors advanced grandly towards the city of Paris. The Parisians also refused to show weakness. They took the initiative to leave the city to meet the enemy, deciding to deliver a head-on blow to the Vikings on the Seine River. Rollo was seen sitting calmly at the bow. The 5,000 Marines behind him also had the look of being well-trained. Ragnar never imagined Rollo would actually train an army of such scale in such a short time, but the arrow had left the bow. There was no turning back. Both sides successively entered battle mode, accompanied by the Vikings blowing the war horn. This battle of the Seine River that would go down in history officially began.
Front line! Advance!
Rollo ordered the vanguard to launch the first attack. As the ships gradually approached, the Vikings fired volleys of rockets, trying to set the warships on fire and stop the impact of the enemy's vanguard.
Loose!
But the Parisians all had iron shields and iron warships. The rockets couldn't cause large-scale damage to them at all. In the gap between the crisscrossing arrows, Rollo's vanguard ships had already rushed to the front. They threw out grappling hooks, trying to board the carrier. The two sides quickly engaged in close-quarters melee combat. The advantages of aircraft carriers began to manifest. Like on land, the Vikings were able to rapidly gather their forces and unleash effective sniping against the Parisians attempting to board their ships. Even if a small number of people boarded the combat platform, they would be surrounded and hacked to death by the Vikings. Before long, the Parisians were retreating one after another. After a fierce battle, the frightened Parisians turned their ships around and returned to their own ranks. The deputies suggested to Rollo to withdraw. With the enemy's morale high now, it would be better for them to return and regroup before fighting another day. Rollo came up to the deputy without a word. The next second, he directly took out his sword and stabbed this person who was disturbing morale to death in front of everyone.
All of my life, and all of your lives, have come to this point. There is nowhere else to be but here. Nowhere else to live or die but here. To be here now is the only thing that matters.
In Rollo's dictionary, there was never any talk of retreat, either win or die. This spirit of viewing death as a return home was precisely the source of the Vikings' strength. Rollo's speech made the Parisian soldiers realize that retreating one step was a dead end. Only by defeating the Vikings could they have a way out. The strong desire to survive made them charge fearlessly towards the opposite side. Seeing the enemy killing their way over with a fierce aura, Ragnar took the last opium pill. He had waited too long for this moment. In his subconscious, even if they lost this war, the Rollo who betrayed him and his people must die. Although the carrier could accommodate a large number of people, the iron ships coming at full speed would cause the wooden carrier to shake violently. It was precisely in the gap when the Vikings lost their balance that the Parisian soldiers all climbed onto the combat platform. The two sides once again fell into close-quarters melee combat. All the Vikings were engaged in battle. Only Ragnar stared at Rollo on the opposite side without moving, his eyes wide with anger. Rollo now also had things he wanted to protect. For his wife, for power and glory. He could betray everything, of course including his own people and elder brother. They rushed towards each other at the same time. The fierce collision of two swords foretold that only one person could survive this battle. Before, Rollo might not have been a match for Ragnar, but ever since Ragnar took opium, his physical condition had greatly declined. They looked like they were punching each other back and forth, but it was obvious Ragnar's condition was worse. He could barely clench his fists. Seeing Ragnar at a disadvantage, Lagertha rushed up regardless of everything, wanting to save him, but in a moment of inattention, she fell into a desperate situation. Fortunately, Bjorn went over in time to save his mother's life. At the same time, a hook pulled Ragnar out of the melee. After removing the hook, Ragnar saw the fallen Lagertha. He immediately told Bjorn to carry Lagertha onto the ship. Perhaps it was because he had been too absorbed in fighting Rollo just now. Only at this moment did Ragnar notice the Parisians had completely gained the upper hand. With the two sides having similar numbers, the Parisian soldiers with a stronger will to survive displayed greater combat power. They caught Vikings and went on a killing spree. Seeing the situation was lost, Ragnar immediately ordered the ropes binding the carrier to be cut, letting everyone abandon ship and escape. He then picked up an axe, intending to settle life and death with Rollo, but just as he was about to rush towards Rollo, two men tackled Ragnar and carried him onto the departing ship.
No! No! Let them go!
With the Vikings' departure, the Battle of the Seine River once again ended with the Parisians' victory. Afterwards, the heavily wounded Rollo returned to the city of Paris. People welcomed him like a hero lining the streets. Princess Gisela stepped forward and embraced and kissed Rollo. From this moment, she truly accepted Rollo from the bottom of her heart. King Charles placed the laurel on Rollo's head and made him general in command of the three armies in Odo's place. Rollo drew his sword and thanked God in French.
Deus! Charist! Paris!
This also declared that Rollo was renouncing the Viking gods and beginning to believe in the Franks' deities. In stark contrast were the Vikings, who suffered a crushing defeat and could only flee in panic. In this great battle, Lagertha miscarried again due to her injuries, and Ragnar directly chose to leave the Kattegat Strait forever. King Ragnar, who had disappeared for several years, returned to his kingdom once again. The Kattegat Strait had now transformed from a poor little fishing village into a prosperous trade hub. Faced with Ragnar's return, the people's eyes no longer held the worship and reverence of the past. Instead, they were filled with loathing and contempt. A large crowd surrounded Ragnar, pointing and whispering. Among them were even Ragnar's sons, who had grown into adults. Seeing his sons' cold gazes and the swords in their hands, eager to be tested, Ragnar understood their intentions. In the Viking tribe, whoever could slay the previous king could sit on the throne and become the sole ruler. Ragnar was deeply pained. He didn't know what he had done wrong to make all his subjects hate him, even to the point that his own sons were drawing swords against him. But he didn't intend to find out the reason. He wanted to ask who had the guts to kill him and become the only king here.
Who wants to be king?
You want to be king, Hooper. Kill me, and you are king.
King Hooper! What are you waiting for? Are you afraid? Be a man.
With Ragnar's overwhelmingly powerful aura, the people present all obediently watched, not daring to move. His second son Ub, not resigned, still walked up with his sword. But after all, blood is thicker than water. In the end, Ub still didn't have the courage to strike his father. Just then, his eldest son Bjorn walked over.
Why did you come back?
A few sons called Ragnar into the woods for a struggle session. Bjorn also explained to his father the reason the people hated him. It turned out that ever since Ragnar had left the Kattegat without a word several years ago, this place had been jointly managed by Bjorn and Aslog. During this time, an envoy from another territory came here and brought two very important pieces of news. Their lord had gone to raid the kingdom of Wessex in England last year and even spent the winter there. They heard that Quenthrith had given birth to a son for Ragnar named Magnus, who now lived in Ecgbert's capital. In addition, they also learned that the tribespeople Ragnar had left in Wessex to farm had been slaughtered. To warn Ragnar, Ecgbert had even specially left one person alive to bring a message to Ragnar. It was obvious that Ragnar definitely knew about this matter. The reason the people were now filled with hatred for Ragnar wasn't just because of the defeat in the invasion of Paris, but also because Ragnar had concealed the fact that the settlement in England had been massacred. Bjorn didn't understand why Ragnar had come back. Ragnar said he missed them, so he came back to see them. Of course, most importantly, he wanted them to join him in going to England for revenge.
What do you say? Bitte? Uber? Sigurd? I can see in your eyes that your answer is also no.
Bjorn indicated he had no interest in England. He took out a map of the Mediterranean. This was obtained during the invasion of Paris. On this map was the Roman Empire that Bjorn had been thinking about.
And places and towns. I want to go there!
How far along are you with your plans?
Floki is building the boat. Witzik has agreed to come with me as well as King Harald and his brother.
Ragnar asked his fourth son Sigurd Snake and Ub why they didn't go together. Ub said the Kattegat Strait was now a trade hub. Many people coveted this place. He and Sigurd had to stay at home to protect their mother, because his youngest son Ivar the Boneless was congenitally disabled. Ragnar didn't ask for his opinion. After bidding farewell to his father, Bjorn found the seer. The seer told Bjorn that Ragnar's return, with his glory gone, would only bring endless death and war, but the seer didn't say who would die.
Then tell me this. What calamity will befall us?
Not one calamity, but calamities too many to number. Now that your father has come back, you are happy to see him, I'm sure. But in truth, you should curse the day.
At the same time, Ragnar found Floki. He hoped Floki could go to England with him, but Floki said he had already agreed to Bjorn first and couldn't go back on his word. Ragnar had no choice but to unwillingly accept this reality. Under the setting sun, Ragnar bared his heart to this old friend. He said he had a feeling that if they didn't sail together this time, they would never have the chance to meet again.
I love you.
What they didn't know was that this parting would truly be forever. After leaving Floki's residence, Ragnar went to Hedeby again to persuade Lagertha. Lagertha now liked a woman. She also kept an owl. Seeing Ragnar arrive, Lagertha felt both joy and sorrow. Joy because she still loved Ragnar in her heart, and sorrow because Ragnar had concealed the matter of the Wessex settlement. Ragnar hoped Lagertha would go to England with him, but Lagertha refused, because that wasn't what she wanted to do. The once devoted husband and wife sat like this quietly. Ragnar said how good it would be if they had never left their previous farm. That way, they could have loved each other, stayed together, and accompanied each other for life. But some things, once missed, could never be returned to. The next day, Lagertha quietly watched Ragnar leave. Tears had long moistened Lagertha's eyes. Astrid walked over and asked Lagertha if she really didn't want to go with Ragnar.
I'm never totally sure about my feelings for Ragnar. I imagine that many women feel the same way as I do. Not wanting and wanting.
Lagertha replied. Ragnar left Hedeby in low spirits. For him now, it's the equivalent of all his relatives abandoning him. Ragnar walked through the entire Viking tribe. Not a single person was willing to believe him or support him. Since that was the case, he might as well die and be done with it. He tied a rope to a tree, intending to end his remaining life just like this. He was once the man who struck fear into the heart of all Europe, but now, he had fallen into such a miserable and destitute state, with everyone rebelling and his kin deserting him. King Ragnar chose to hang himself to end his remaining life, but as fate would have it, a raven landed on his shoulder and pecked through the hanging rope. It seemed the gods didn't want him to die so easily. The dispirited Ragnar returned home and happened to see his congenitally disabled youngest son Ivar sitting on Ragnar's throne. Ragnar poured out his heart's sorrows to Ivar. He said he never thought that after a lifetime of military service, he would end up with everyone rebelling and his kin deserting him. He had wanted to invade England again to avenge the previous humiliation, but walking through the entire Viking tribe, not a single person was willing to follow him, including even Ivar's 4 good older brothers. Ivar was very dissatisfied with his father. He complained that his father had never asked for his opinion. Ragnar smiled bitterly as he looked at his son's disabled legs. Ivar knew his father's concerns, but he equally hoped he could be treated fairly like his brothers. Ragnar had no choice but to satisfy him. As soon as Ragnar finished saying Ivar's name, Ivar resolutely expressed his stance.
Ivar. Of course I'll come.
Perhaps Ragnar never thought this decision would make Ivar the boneless name resound throughout Europe and become a lingering nightmare for England. The next day, with Ivar's support, Ragnar planned to recruit some warriors to follow him to England. He set up a stool and sat on the street for an entire day, but sadly, not a single person in the bustling crowd was willing to stop in front of him. But Ragnar still didn't give up. He put down his kingly dignity and stopped passers-by one by one to ask,
And if I had the mind to raid, I would raid with your son, and not with you. For I believe the gods have deserted you. King Ragnar Lothbrok! You are on your own. Everyone hates you now.
Since the defeat in Paris, no one considered Ragnar a hero of the Vikings anymore. In addition, he concealed the fact that his people had been massacred in the Wessex settlement. This made Ragnar completely lose the people's hearts in the Kattegat Strait. After being mocked, Ragnar had no choice but to find his son Bjorn. Bjorn spoke of his plan. Now, he had no desire to invade England at all. Instead, he had a strong interest in the Roman Empire near the Mediterranean. After all, that was a place they hadn't been to before. This way, the enemy would have no defenses at all. But there was a thorny problem in front of them. To go to the Mediterranean, they had to pass the coastline of the Franks. Bjorn decided to go talk to his uncle Rollo then and have him let them through. Ever since the last battle of the Seine River, Ragnar had declared he no longer had this brother, so he didn't want to mention this person again. After failing to dissuade him, Ragnar also didn't want to interfere with his son's plans anymore. When parting, he finally thickened his skin and stated the purpose of his visit to Bjorn.
There is one thing I need your help with. What? I need ships.
After all, he was his own father. In the end, Bjorn still agreed to give Ragnar a few warships.
You've become a man in my absence. I'm proud of you.
What they don't know is that this parting will be yin and yang. Before long, the Harald brothers brought their fleet to the Kattegat Strait. They also came to join Bjorn. Ragnar saw the Harald brothers' grand fleet from the mountain and felt a complex mix of emotions. Before setting off, Lagertha also brought Astrid to see Bjorn off. Bjorn asked his mother why she didn't go with him. Lagertha's answer was profound. She said she had to stay to take back what she had lost. At the banquet, aside from Ragnar, all the friends who had once stained the Seine River with blood gathered together. Lagertha invited a Slog to jointly preside over the pre-battle sacrifice, but was rejected by a Slog.
You forget, Lagertha, I am the queen. I never forget anything.
Although Lagertha was displeased, she didn't say much. This made her even more determined to get rid of a Slog. After completing the sacrifice, Lagertha found a Slog alone and then responded with her attitude in a domineering manner.
I know you can hear me. I want you to know that I can never forgive you for taking away my husband and my world. And look what you've done with it. You call yourself queen, but you will never be queen in Kattegat.
The next day, Bjorn and the others set off grandly towards the Mediterranean, but Ragnar couldn't recruit any soldiers at all with his influence. He had no choice but to dig up the gold and silver jewelry he had buried earlier. He had originally planned to use these things in Valhalla. Now, bringing them out again was a helpless move. It must be said, money is indeed a good thing. With these chests of treasures, Ragnar was indeed able to recruit warriors, but it was like this: these people didn't look like they were going to fight, but more like they were going to a funeral. The young had all gone with Bjorn to the Mediterranean. Although these people were a bit old, at least it was better than nothing. Ivar told a Slog that he wanted to go to England with his father. A Slog tried to stop him in every way, but Ivar insisted on going. He didn't want to continue staying in the greenhouse. Because of his congenital disability, his mother doted on him in every way. This made Ivar suffocate. Now, being able to go to England with his father to prove himself. Even if it was just for a day as a real man, Ivar felt it was worth it in this life. A slog couldn't persuade Ivar and could only agree. In the blink of an eye, it was the day for Ragnar to set sail. On the vast sea, there were only 3 drifting lonely boats. Compared to Bjorn's huge fleet, it was simply worlds apart. Looking at the group of old men on the ship, half of whose bodies were already in the ground, Ragnar wanted to cry but had no tears. But to fulfill his long-cherished wish, Ragnar still resolutely set off for England without hesitation. Ragnar took 3 warships with a total of over 100 people, preparing to go raid England, but the heavens are unpredictable. A deadly storm completely disrupted his plans. Since it was his first time on a ship, the congenitally disabled Ivar was so frightened he tightly hugged the pillar on the ship. To prevent his son from being knocked off the ship by the waves, Ragnar had no choice but to resort to tying Ivar to the mast. It must be said, this trick really worked. Several waves crashed over, but Ivar narrowly escaped them all. But then, 100-meter high towering giant wave swept in. Ragnar looked at his son in despair. This time, he was probably powerless to turn the tide. The giant wave directly tore the small boat to shreds. Ivar, who was tied to the mast, also sank with the ship at an accelerating speed. At the critical moment of life and death, Ragnar used all his strength to untie the rope and then pushed his son to the water surface. When Ivar woke up again, he found himself washed ashore. Fortunately, Ragnar had also narrowly survived. But before they had time to rejoice, a group of people suddenly appeared in the distance. If the other party were English soldiers, they would surely be doomed. Fortunately, this group was also the elderly team members washed ashore. There weren't many people to begin with. After a storm, there were only about a dozen people left. They hid in a cave and discussed countermeasures. Now they were in enemy territory, and with so few people, wanting to find Egbert for revenge was simply a pipe dream. They had no ships to go back either. The only option now was to steal a ship on the coast and then hurry back home. But as soon as they left the beach, they encountered Wessex cavalry on patrol. Everyone immediately lay down, narrowly escaping disaster. However, the wreckage on the beach still exposed their landing location. Ethelwulf recognized Ragnar's flag at a glance. To escape pursuit, Ragnar led them through the forest. Suddenly, the appearance of a little girl interrupted their path. Who would have thought that Ragnar, the legendary leader who once rampaged across Europe, would now be so frightened by a little girl picking mushrooms that he didn't even dare to breathe heavily? To avoid leaving any more traces, they could only quietly wait for the little girl to leave. While everyone was resting, Ivar found his father alone and asked about his next plan.
You think it's possible we might be able to steal a boat?
I didn't come here to go back. That is where we can no longer travel with our friends.
What are you talking about?
It can only be you. And me.
It was obvious Ragnar was dead set on seeking revenge. He couldn't accept returning empty-handed like this, since a dozen people couldn't accomplish anything and would easily expose the target. They might as well adopt a desperate strategy and shed their burdens. That night, while everyone was fast asleep, they mercilessly slit the throats of their tribesmen one by one. Who would have thought that the agility of the disabled Ivar would be so nimble? A woman tried to seduce Ivar with her beauty to save her life. Unfortunately, she found the wrong person. After getting rid of their burdens, Ragnar carried his son and headed towards Wessex's capital. At the same time, Egbert receives news that a group of Vikings have died in the forest. Killed by whoever they are, they searched the forest extensively for Ragnar's tracks. Ragnar and his son hid in the bushes to avoid pursuit. Here, Ragnar had a heart-to-heart talk with his son. When he saw Ivar's legs at birth, he thought this child surely wouldn't live long. After all, it was in the harsh environment of the Middle Ages. But later, I found I was wrong. The gods closed one door for you, but opened a window. You possess the tenacity, decisiveness, and wisdom that your brothers don't have. This journey with his father let Ivar experience a fatherly love he had never known before. In all these years, he had never talked so much with his father. As they were chatting, they arrived outside Wessex's capital. Ragnar put his son by the roadside and then told Ivar some important things. As soon as we go in, we'll have to separate. No matter what happens, you must control your emotions and act like an ordinary disabled person.
I think you brought me here for a reason.
No matter what they do to me, you have to act like a cripple. And then they won't feel threatened by you.
With that, Ragnar walked towards the gates and Ivar climbed towards the gates. The soldiers on the city gate were very surprised to see Ragnar and his son coming. Although they didn't know Ragnar, they could tell from their attire that they were Vikings. Ragnar claimed he wanted to see Egbert. Too bad Egbert wasn't there. Ethelwulf received him.
We may have captured him. For the love of God, do you not know who this is? It's Ragnar Lothbrok, the king of the Northmen. Seize him!
Ethelwulf finally had a chance to vent his anger. Catching Ragnar wasn't enough. He also ordered the soldiers to give Ragnar a round of punches and kicks. Ragnar, enduring the pain on his body, kept reminding Ivar not to act impulsively. The exhausted Ragnar was beaten unconscious. When he woke up, he found himself locked in an iron cage.
I want you to know that I can never forgive you for taking away my husband and my world.
You call yourself queen, but you will never be queen in Kattegat.
She endured for 20 years, just waiting for an opportunity. She didn't want to prove how remarkable she was, but wanted to tell others that she would definitely take back what she lost with her own hands. Lagertha drew her sword and, with a wave, charged with all her men towards Aslog, the woman who had stolen her husband. Just a few days ago, Bjorn had taken almost all the warriors to raid the Mediterranean, and Ragnar had taken a group of old men. The defenses of Kattegat were now very empty. Lagertha planned to take advantage of this opportunity to reclaim the happiness and status that should have been hers. But Ragnar's two sons were still there. Lagertha couldn't bear to kill her ex-husband's bloodline, so the next day, Lagertha invited Ub and Sigurd to Hedeby as guests. During the dinner banquet, Lagertha's girlfriend Astrid began probing the two brothers, trying to find out the remaining military strength of the Kattegat Strait. But the two brothers weren't fools either. They directly avoided this sensitive topic. Seeing that she couldn't get anything out of them, Astrid used the beauty trap. Just as Ub was getting intimate with the female slave arranged by Astrid, Astrid brought people and barged into the room, directly capturing him. The two brothers were successively tricked and imprisoned. By the time they reacted, Lagertha had already arrived at the Kattegat Strait with her men. They launched a surprise attack from both land and water routes. Lagertha waved her sword, and several hundred warriors fiercely charged towards the unsuspecting village. At the same time, the naval troops also successfully landed. They were unstoppable, catching the enemy and crazily slaughtering them. Aslog's team immediately organized a strong shield formation to block the road and fend off the other side's opportunity. But in terms of talent in warfare, even 10 Aslogs were no match for one Lagertha. When the two sides were at a stalemate, Lagertha ordered a pair of archers to climb onto the houses and shoot at the enemy's rear, instantly shattering their shield formation. After gaining an absolute advantage, Lagertha didn't hastily exterminate the villagers. After all, these people had once been her subjects too. Aslog knew she had lost, so she took up the sword that symbolized the king's power. She put on decent clothes and, holding the sword with both hands, came before Lagertha.
How strange, Lagertha, that you should play the usurper. One woman against another doesn't quite fit with your reputation.
Now, there's never the usurper, always the usurped. You took my husband, my world, and my happiness. The fact that you're a woman is neither here nor there.
Aslog began mocking Lagertha again, saying she couldn't have children. After marrying Ragnar, not only did she give birth to 4 sons for him, but they had all grown up now. Then Aslog threw the sword on the ground, saying she wouldn't fight Lagertha. She only begged Lagertha to spare her. That way, she could ensure that her sons would not come to take revenge on Lagertha.
I understand.
The expression on Aslog's face gradually changed from smug to stiff. What she never understood until her death was that in this world, anyone who dared to threaten Lagertha had, without exception, all gone to be reincarnated. After killing Aslog, Lagertha officially became the Queen of Kattegat. Before long, Lagertha released Ub and Sigurd. Upon learning the news that their mother had been killed, the grief-stricken Ub rushed up to avenge his mother. Ub also displayed extraordinary combat power, but Lagertha remained calm and collected from beginning to end. As Ub gradually approached, Lagertha just lightly waved her arm, and a group of men easily subdued him. After the two brothers were locked up, they decided to wait for Hvitserk and Ivar to return, then discuss countermeasures and take revenge on Lagertha together. At the same time, Bjorn had already sailed the fleet to the coast of Francia. The vigilance in Francia was very high now, judging from the flags on the sails. It was the Duke of Normandy. It seemed that Rollo had become the Duke of Normandy by this time. Bjorn didn't attack these ships, but let them go back and report that he wanted to talk to his uncle Rollo. Everyone came to Rollo's castle. Rollo warmly welcomed Bjorn and the others. So many years had passed in a flash. Hatred would also diminish with the passage of time. Rollo introduced his wife Princess Gisela and his children. Rollo now had a large family. Rollo inquired about the purpose of Bjorn's visit. Bjorn said he wanted to go raid the Roman Empire near the Mediterranean. He had to pass along the coast of Francia, so he hoped Rollo could do him a favor and give him a green light or something.
In return for what?
In return for not attacking your villages and towns, like we should do.
Rollo's not intimidated. In the Battle of Paris a few years ago, who knows who was the losing side? So Rollo directly ordered his men to seize this group of people. After being locked up for a day, several guards came to the cell and took Bjorn away alone. It turned out Rollo had gone to find someone who could read maps. The librarian brought a full map of the Roman Empire at its peak. While Bjorn's map was only a small part of the Roman Empire, Rollo's eyes lit up. The librarian's meaning was that there were a large amount of fertile land and wealth near that inland sea. But in comparison, Bjorn was still more concerned about whether Rollo could give the green light to ensure he could sail past the French coast safely.
No. Only if you allow me.
Who would have thought that after staying in Paris for so many years, although Rollo dressed like a Parisian, he was still a Viking at heart. At this point, Bjorn had no choice but to agree to his uncle's condition.
Everything you say is true. But I cannot deny that part of myself which is still Viking, no matter how hard I try. When you hear thunder, it's only thunder. But for me, it is still Thor beating his hammer.
Princess Gisela was furious when she heard this. At the beginning, it was you who said you would give up the Viking beliefs, and only then did I agree to marry you. Now we're married and have a bunch of children, but you want to go be a robber and raid again? If you dare to step out of the house, we're getting divorced. Who would have thought that Ragnar, the legendary leader who once rampaged across Europe, would be locked in a dog cage and subjected to such inhuman abuse by English soldiers? But the English would never have imagined that this humiliation would bring a catastrophe to their country, because this was the last scheme Ragnar carefully laid out before his death. Just now, Ragnar had taken his congenitally disabled youngest son Ivar deep into enemy territory, arriving at the city gate of Wessex, England. Before entering, Ragnar repeatedly warned Ivar that no matter what kind of torture he suffered next, Ivar had to control his emotions and appear harmless. This way, the English would not feel Ivar posed a threat to them. Although Ivar didn't know how his father would implement his revenge plan next, he still agreed to Ragnar's instructions. After explaining, father and son resolutely walked towards the city gate. Upon seeing this Viking leader who had invaded their country countless times, Ethelwulf immediately ordered his men to seize him. To vent his anger, Ethelwulf ordered the soldiers to give Ragnar a frenzied beating. Seeing his father being brutally beaten, Ivar's eyes burst with raging flames, but in the end, he still carefully listened to his father's instructions. Ragnar was beaten unconscious. When he woke up again, he found himself imprisoned in an iron cage like a beast. Before long, Egbert returned to Wessex. When he heard his old friend had been captured, Egbert was also very excited, so he immediately ordered Ragnar to be carried to the Great Hall. After many years, who would have thought their reunion would be in such a manner? Egbert prepared food for Ragnar, but Ragnar indicated he wouldn't eat until he saw his son, so Egbert had the soldiers bring Ivar out.
Eet u het,
Ja, vader. Det förtjänar du. Svärfelisk.
Seeing Ivar eat, only then did Ragnar begin to devour the food ravenously. Egbert assured Ragnar he would not harm Ivar. After all, that was Ragnar's son, he would definitely treat him well. Then Egbert asked Ragnar if he had come because of the matter of the Viking settlement being massacred. Egbert frankly admitted that Ethelwulf had destroyed the settlement under his orders. It was all his strategy. Seeing Ragnar not say anything, Egbert called over a child. This child had blonde hair and blue eyes. Named Magnus, Egbert said this was Ragnar's son with Quenthrith. The kingdom of Mercia had now been annexed by him. Quenthrith had also died in battle, so he had been raising their son. Magnus was very happy to see Ragnar. When he was young, he had heard his mother tell many heroic stories about Ragnar. Although Ragnar was now locked in a cage, one could see from Magnus' eyes that he was full of admiration for Ragnar. However, Ragnar did not acknowledge Magnus as his son. He said Quenthrith had always looked down on him, so nothing had happened between the two of them. Seeing this, Egbert had no choice but to let Magnus leave for now. In fact, anyone who watched the previous plot would know that Ragnar and Quenthrith did indeed have a one-night stand. Now that he was a prisoner, what good would it do to acknowledge the son? Moreover, Ragnar understood that Ivar was a cripple and posed no threat, so Egbert might let him go. If he acknowledged Magnus at this time, then after his death, Magnus would definitely not have a good end. Finally, Egbert released Ragnar from the iron cage. The two finally got to the point. Egbert said Ragnar had to die because this world needed invaders like him to die, but he didn't want Ragnar to die by his hand. Ragnar knew Egbert's concern. He was afraid that once he killed Ragnar, Ragnar's sons would lead a large number of Vikings to seek revenge on him. Egbert was such a shrewd man. He wanted Ragnar to die, but didn't want to bring trouble upon himself. So Ragnar gave Egbert an idea. He told Egbert to hand him over to King El of Northumbria. El hated him to the bone and would be happy to do it. This way, Egbert's hands would not be stained with Ragnar's blood, but at the same time, Ragnar proposed the last deal of his life.
Let my crippled son Ivar go home. He's obviously no threat to you. You arrange for a ship for sailors. You just make sure my son gets home safely.
You have my word. In return,
I'll tell my son Ivar to tell his brothers that you did everything you could to save me, that you and we are sworn friends, and that King Aela was solely responsible for my death.
Egbert agreed. Perhaps this was the answer he wanted, but Egbert had not anticipated that Ragnar was setting a trap for him with his own life. As Ivar was about to be sent home, Ragnar requested to see his son one last time. This was Ragnar and Ivar's final conversation. Only at this moment did Ivar know his father's true purpose in summoning him to England. His father wanted him to spread what happened in England to every Viking tribe. Ragnar knew he no longer had the strength to take revenge. He could only use his death to awaken the fury of his sons, thus achieving the purpose of vengeance, and the target of revenge was not El, but Egbert.
Egbert is handing me over to King Aela, who will kill me.
If this Aela is going to kill you, then me and all my brothers will seek for revenge, and you know that.
Yes. Oh, you must seek revenge, but not on Aela. On Egbert.
Ragnar's purpose in coming to England this time was precisely to avenge those Viking villagers massacred by Egbert. This matter had been pressing on his chest like a huge rock. For this long-cherished wish, Ragnar was willing to give up his life to make Egbert pay blood for blood. After explaining, Ivar was sent to the port to return to the north, and Ragnar was taken to the kingdom of Northumbria. There, Ragnar would suffer inhuman abuse and such a brutal and inhumane death. He is a legend of the Vikings, a name that strikes terror throughout Europe. Yet, at this moment, Ragnar is about to endure a gruesome death. Ragnar, who was just recently locked up in a dog cage, was escorted by over 100 English soldiers to the Kingdom of Northumbria in England. For such a Viking leader, who once slaughtered thousands, even his breath could make those around him shudder with fear. Even during rest at night, the English soldiers formed several circles, not daring to show the slightest slackness. Out of curiosity, a soldier wanted to touch Ragnar to see what set him apart from ordinary people. In the end, Ragnar didn't kill the soldiers. He knew that his journey to meet his fate held great significance, so he did not want to complicate matters and die halfway there. After 2 days of hard travel, Ragnar was finally brought to the Kingdom of Northumbria. King El couldn't wait to meet Ragnar outside the city. He had been waiting for this moment for too long. More than 20 years ago, when Ragnar first led the Vikings to pillage his kingdom, El swore to God that he would take apart Ragnar to cleanse his shame. Now his wish was about to come true.
And I swear, before you die, you will atone for your sins against my countrymen.
After saying this, El ordered Ragnar, in his cage, to be lifted into the air, and the soldiers continued to poke at Ragnar under the cage with their spears. El, feeling unsatisfied, also commanded his men to roast Ragnar. From afar, one could even hear the sizzling sound of flesh burning. Thus, Ragnar was tortured by hundreds of people for a whole day and night. When El felt he had tortured Ragnar enough, he prepared to kill Ragnar to placate the souls of the tens of thousands of innocent people slaughtered by the Vikings. Before the execution, the soldiers gave Ragnar another brutal beating. Faced with such torture, Ragnar didn't make a sound, which greatly annoyed King El. He wanted to hear Ragnar's pleas to vent his anger. So, El subjected Ragnar to even more cruel abuses. Facing such a resilient enemy, King El showed an incredible expression. He pulled out his dagger and carved a deep cross on Ragnar's forehead. How the little piggies will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. But obviously, with El's intelligence, he could hardly understand the meaning of this sentence. Ragnar walked back to the cage, waiting for death, and scenes from the past began to flash back in his mind. With Ragnar's growing desire for glory and land, his life began to fall apart, ending up in a state of family discord and estrangement. But even if he had another 100 lifetimes, Ragnar would never regret his decision, because the Viking soul is deeply ingrained in his bones. Dying in battle for honor was the faith he clung to throughout his life. Ragnar was awakened by the prayers of the English people, and among the crowd, he saw a familiar figure. Egbert, in disguise, had come a long way to be present. From his eyes, one could see a trace of regret at the end of such a legendary leader. The soldiers pulled open a large hole under the cage, and amid the mournful singing, a large number of poisonous snakes were released into the pit. Ragnar shouts the last words of his life with emotion.
It gladdens me to know that Odin prepares for a feast. Soon I shall be drinking ale from curved horns. This hero that comes into Valhalla does not lament his death. I shall not enter Odin's hall with fear. There, I shall wait for my sons to join me. And when they do, I will bask in their tales of triumph.
Calmly facing death with no trace of fear, Ragnar believed that his death would ignite the fury of his sons' revenge, make them more united, and their accomplishments would far exceed his own. Ragnar fell into the snake pit. The snakes bit and tore at his body, but he never let out a cry. Looking at Ragnar's death, King El revealed a triumphant smile. But what I didn't realize was that Ragnar's sons were about to lead the Vikings in a total onslaught, and the flames of war would burn every inch of England's land. What awaits El is the Vikings' most cruel revenge punishment, the Blood Eagle. Ragnar is dead, were the most heartbreaking words Lagertha has heard in her life. But without seeing her ex-husband's body, Lagertha could never believe any rumors.
I am sorry. Forgive me, but if he is dead...
If Ragnar is truly dead, Lagertha has decided to take on the responsibility of ruling the entire Kattegat Strait and even the whole country. The next day, Lagertha, as the queen, held a meeting in the hall. She didn't know what Ragnar's fate was and whether he would come back. But during the days without Ragnar, Lagertha decided to build city walls and fortifications to fend off invaders. After all, Kattegat is now the most prosperous place in Norway with the largest trade volume. Many people must covet its wealth and land.
Those who share my belief, say aye.
Ivar crawled over, holding his iron club. His eyes were filled with a murderous aura. It looks like Ivar, who just returned to Kattegat, has learned of his mother Aslog's murder by Lagertha.
I want revenge. I challenge you to single combat.
The crowd was stunned by Ivar's words. No one could expect Elaine to challenge the first shield maiden of the Vikings. However, Lagertha resolutely rejected his challenge.
I refuse.
You can't refuse.
I refuse to fight you, Ivar Lothbrok, son of Ragnar. I don't want to kill you.
Who says you would kill me?
I do.
I don't care, just as long as you know that one day I will kill you, Lagertha. Your fate is fixed.
Lagertha knows all too well that Ivar won't let it go. In the days that followed, Lagertha led her people to build forts and trenches. Every day she would look into the distance, hoping that one day Ragnar could come back. But she never saw the figure that had flashed through her mind millions of times. One night, Lagertha suddenly woke up from her sleep, and in a daze, she finally saw Ragnar, whom she'd been missing. But when she reached out to touch him, she realized it was all an illusion. The lovesick Lagertha found the seer. She wanted to know if Ragnar was still in this world. The seer told her that Ragnar was on his way to Valhalla, which meant Ragnar had indeed fallen. Lagertha composed her emotions and asked the last question.
Will I be killed by a son of Ragnar?
Yes.
Meanwhile, Bjorn, who was exploring the Mediterranean, just sailed into a foggy area, and the sunstone was of no use. Judging by their wild appearance, they seemed to have been stuck at sea for a long time. Fortunately, after a period of sailing, they finally saw the long-lost land. Although they didn't know where they were, they decided to find a port and pillage some supplies since their food and fresh water had run out. This was the port of Alhucemas, Spain. People were selecting goods at the night market, a bustling scene, but they were completely unaware that the Vikings had quietly landed and stormed into the city. When the figure of the pirates appeared, when the crowd immediately fled in fear. But the Vikings do not care about that. They see a man on a knife to kill, see the woman on the spot to rape and kill. After their purchase, they didn't forget to take a group of beautiful women back to the ship to enjoy. They continued on their way to the Roman Empire. As they left Spain, everyone looked down the Straits of Gibraltar. Bjorn, full of emotions, finally made it to the Mediterranean. His journey was further than that of any of his tribespeople, surpassing even his father Ragnar's achievements. But at that moment, the call of Odin's crows could be heard in the distance.
Now the little piggies will grant when they hear the old poem sung.
Wessex, did you hear him too?
Yes.
At the same time, a man in black stepped onto the ferry of Kattegat, exuding an incredibly powerful aura. It must have been Odin himself who came to convey the news of Ragnar's death.
Ivar, your father is dead. Killed by serpents. Cold. In the cold iron earth, Ragnar lies.
Ragnar's 5 sons received the news of their father's death one after the other. On the spot, Bjorn decided to return. Rome wasn't important anymore. Avenging his father was the most pressing matter. Soon, their fleet reached the coast of Francia. Rollo also wanted to take vengeance for his brother, but the Vikings would never accept him again. When parting with everyone, Rollo invited anyone willing to stay to live in Normandy. However, even though the living conditions in Paris were miles better than in Kattegat, not a single person entertained the thought. In the hearts of the Vikings, once a traitor, always a public enemy of the Vikings.
You should have killed him when you had the chance. Why would you say that? Because I have a bad feeling that he will reach more fame than any of you.
The three sons at home were not idle either. They decided to form the largest Viking army in the history of the Vikings in the name of Ragnar and Odin and declared war on England and even the world. This is the most massive army in the history of the Vikings. They assembled nearly all the fighting Viking warriors in the north in the name of Ragnar. Like a towering wave, they rushed towards the English army. King El could never imagine that killing just one Viking leader could bring about the destruction of his entire country. And what awaits El is a form of torture far more horrifying than being drawn and quartered the blood eagle. Not long ago, Ivar spread the news of his father Ragnar's death, and countless Vikings rushed to Kattegat. They stated that Ragnar is the totem of the Vikings, the father of every Viking. Now that their father has been killed, all Vikings should rise up and seek revenge. At the same time, Ivar and Ub were carrying out their plan. In addition to avenging Ragnar, Ivar also wanted to kill Lagertha before the army set off, to avenge his mother. At this time, Lagertha was unknowing. She was still holding a feast in her territory to welcome everyone, but in the middle of the feast, the guards at the door were suddenly controlled and then the doors were closed one after another. Before they could react, the shield maidens in the room were also controlled. After everything was ready, Ub and Ivar also stepped out of the crowd. Lagertha instantly understood everything. She calmly stood up, took her weapon from the throne, and slowly walked towards the two brothers. Just when everyone was tense, the door was suddenly pushed open.
If you kill her, my brothers, you have to kill me too.
Maybe we should.
Shut up. She killed our mother.
I know. You want revenge. So would I. But more importantly, we have to avenge our father.
It turned out to be Bjorn returning from the Mediterranean. Bjorn's reputation among the people is the highest now. Ub does not want to be an enemy of Bjorn. After all, Bjorn is his elder brother who grew up with him. At Ub's urging, the brothers put their revenge plans on hold. Yet the crisis was not over. At the construction site in the middle of the night, the Harald brothers and a man were plotting a major event. Harald told Egil that he was about to join Ragnar's sons on an expedition to England. During this time, he wanted Egil to help him conquer Kattegat while the city's defenses were empty. Looking at the fortifications being built, Egil assures the brothers that he will find a weakness in the defenses and help Harald to unite Norway and become king of the Vikings. The next day, Ivar, who had failed to get his revenge, came to Floki, not only to visit him, but also to ask Floki to help him find a solution to his leg problem. As Bjorn's army returns, the conditions for heading to England are gradually maturing. Ivar, with disabled legs, does not want to crawl around on the battlefield. Hearing this, Floki instantly understood his meaning, and not long after, he built a chariot for Ivar. Seeing such a gift, Ivar was indescribably excited, so he tried it out on the spot. When the warhorse carried him galloping, Ivar couldn't help screaming loudly. After all, this was the first time in his life that he experienced the sense of galloping freely. There were more and more people coming to Kattegat at this time. The brothers had not expected so many people to respond to their call when spreading the news. Now that the revenge army is there, the next question is who will command the three armies. Ivar told Ub that he wanted to be the commander, because when he was accompanying his father in his final moments, Ragnar pointed him out and also saw that he could bring a bright future to the Vikings. However, Ub and other brothers all thought that Bjorn was the only choice for commander. After all, Bjorn had followed his father to fight in the south and north, and his practical experience was very rich. But now it's just a talk. And after the army was assembled, the brothers finally brought up this issue.
We are all equally Ragnar's sons, but we are not equal in battle. So I will take the lead. I will establish the battle plans, and I will give the orders. Do you understand that? But what do you know? What have you done? What battles have you won? And what battles have you lost? You don't want to listen, that is your choice. But I am the leader of this great army. Me! And you will obey me!
With leadership decided, the largest fleet the Vikings had ever assembled headed for England. Bjorn devised a strategic plan to pick the soft persimmons first. wipe out El, then find Egbert for revenge, and none of the two kings could escape. Soon, the news of the Vikings landing in Northumbria reached El, but he was not afraid at all. He thought it was just a few pagans and was not worthy of fear. Before he left, El boasted to his daughters that he was well prepared, and that he would give Ragnar's sons a special welcome. Then El left with his army of 100. He stood confidently on the hill, and when he saw the Vikings team, he instantly felt confident of victory, because the enemy seemed to only be 100 or so. However, the next second, the expression on El's face gradually became stiff. With Ivar's chariots sweeping through the front of the formation, the Viking army was officially lined up. Looking out, this force seemed to be tens of thousands, and El was scared to stand still. The strength of the two sides is simply incomparable. Now it is too late to run. With Bjorn's order, the Vikings surged like a tide against the English army. Without a doubt, Northumbria's army was completely annihilated. El was captured, and Ivar dragged El all the way to the sacred land where Ragnar died. Looking at Ragnar's ferocious sons, El realized what a terrible mistake he had made in killing Ragnar. Only when they opened the cold pit did they find that Ragnar's skeleton had long since disappeared. The sons' fury reached its peak instantly. At this point, El was even trying to buy back his own life with money.
Du mig sägst. Min fader har haft mig rätt och gold and silver. Napiseo
Floki grabbed El, intending to show him what the cruelest punishment in the world looked like.
I've been told your god is a carpenter. And guess what? So am I.
It is a torture more cruel than quartering. I guarantee that when this human artwork is complete, you will be shocked by the Vikings' cruelty. They pinned King El's hands to a large tree. Bjorn did it himself. He ripped off El's clothes and took out a red-hot dagger and stabbed it into El's back. El's heart-wrenching howls echo across the horizon, but Bjorn obviously won't stop there. He uses the dagger to cut open the flesh along El's spine and forcefully pulls apart the flesh to separate it from the bone. Then Bjorn takes an axe and violently strikes El's exposed spine. Ivar crawls step by step to El's face, staring into his eyes. He wants to see where the arrogance of El, who killed his father Ragnar, has gone. The severe pain finally made El stop struggling. The next day, after El's blood ran dry, they hung his body. A breeze blew, and the flickering wings formed the artwork in the eyes of the Vikings, the Blood Eagle. With El as his burial companion, Ragnar's eternal rest in this place should not be lonely. El paid the price of annihilating his country for his act of killing Ragnar. But obviously, this is just the first step in Ragnar's son's revenge. Next up is Egbert of the Kingdom of Wessex. At the same time, the dying bishop of Northumbria was brought to Egbert. He learned from him that Northumbria had been wiped out by the Vikings. Ethelwulf wanted to ask how many people were on the other side, and the bishop answered like this.
How many blades of grass are there in a field?
What does that mean? Hundreds? Thousands? Tell me. Tell me!
Ethelwulf seemed to understand his meaning. The number of soldiers on the other side was as numerous as the number of grass stalks on the field. He blames his father for letting that cripple go. Now the guy is back with a Viking army, but it's pointless to say these things now. The urgent task is to mobilize all the national troops to fight against the Vikings. Since Egbert was old, the heavy responsibility of leading the three armies fell on Ethelwulf. Indeed, as Ethelwulf expected, Ragnar's sons had already landed near Repton in Mercia. They planned to camp here for a little rest, then planned to launch a total offensive on the capital of Wessex. Meanwhile, Ethelwulf also gathered his army. It was a two-country coalition of Mercia and Wessex. In terms of numbers, This army was about equal to the Viking forces. Seeing Ethelwulf leading the charge, the soldiers began to cheer loudly. After gathering information about the enemy, Ethelwulf decided to lead his troops to Repton to stop the war at the borderlines. Meanwhile, a Viking infighting was being staged in the distant Kattegat Strait. As Norway's busiest trade center, a large number of merchants came and went every day. However, when this group entered the city, Torvi, Bjorn's wife, sensed something was wrong because they were only observing but not buying. Unlike ordinary traders, Torvi quietly followed them, and a small-scale battle soon unfolded. These individuals were all slain by the shield maidens, but Lagertha realized that these men were possibly spies scouting the city's defenses. A larger attack may be imminent. Sure enough, as Lagertha was deliberating on how to plan the defense, the call to war was sounded.
They're here.
Lagertha immediately grabbed her sword and headed to the tower. The invaders chose to storm the city walls and enter the city directly. Simultaneously, the dock was also under enemy attack. It turned out that the enemy was employing diversionary tactics. They pretended to attack up front while secretly landing on the shore by boat. With everyone occupied guarding the front, the rear was left undefended, allowing the enemy to break into the city without much resistance. At this moment, Lagertha was commanding the battle from a high tower. She quickly realized that there had been a sneak attack from behind. She rushed back with her girlfriend, Astrid, to defend the city, leading Torvi to command at the front. The leader of the attack on Kattegat was Egil. He planned to lead his men directly to the Great Hall from the rear. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until they encountered Lagertha emerging from an alley with a torch in hand. Upon seeing Lagertha, the enemy forces charged straight towards her. Lagertha simply threw the torch to the ground and a fire started. Seeing this, the rest fled because they were only mercenaries and were also outnumbered. Their main concern was to save their lives. Seeing this, Egil had no choice but to charge alone, but he was instantly hit by a javelin and collapsed. Lagertha didn't kill him but instead roasted him like a skewer over a fire. Lagertha knew that Egil was not a king or a lord, and he couldn't have mustered such a large number of soldiers on his own. Therefore, someone must be pulling the strings from behind. After some questioning, Egil finally revealed Harald's brothers. Meanwhile, the rejuvenated Viking avenging army set off towards Wessex. On the way, scouts from the front report that the English army is also on its way, and in great numbers. Both sides would likely meet in a day. Bjorn immediately ordered a camp to be set up on the spot to prepare for the battle in the morning. This would a fight in the name of their father. However, Ivar had a different idea.
Why don't we plan to fight in a different way and surprise them?
Our warriors won't understand what's happening. We fight in the shield wall, that's how we fight.
But we have a bigger army now. And they have a bigger army now, Wessex. Cannot fight in the same way.
Ivar wanted to risk going to the battlefield to study the terrain and turn that into their advantage by catching the enemy off guard. From this, we can see that Ivar had the highest military talent among his brothers. Bjorn agreed to go with Ivar. After all, victory in war is more important than sticking to tradition. The next day, as dawn was just breaking, the two armies met in an open field. Ivar's military genius would shine in this historic battle. This was a famed battle that determined whether England would fall. The Vikings summoned 3,000 warriors and camped on a hill. Facing them were 4,000 English soldiers, gathered from all over the country. But when the two armies were facing each other, the Vikings inexplicably gave up the favorable terrain and left, which made Ethelwulf a bit confused. After considering his options, Ethelwulf ordered an assault up the hill.
Captain! Flank!
However, when they reached the top, they found the Vikings had vanished. While Ethelwulf was pondering the situation, one of his commanders discovered that the Vikings had somehow circled behind them through the woods. Ethelwulf hastily turned to pursue them, but before they could reach the Vikings, they disappeared into the woods. Suddenly, cold arrows flew out from the woods, instantly killing and injuring any soldiers close to the tree line. Ethelwulf immediately ordered his men to form a shield wall, but as soon as they formed the wall, the enemy's arrow fire ceased. Ethelwulf was enraged by such a dirty tactic. He ignored the soldiers and went into the woods single-handedly, but when he came here he realized that the woods were already empty. Just as he turned around, he saw the Vikings reappear on the hill. In rage, Ethelwulf commanded his men to recapture the hill and kill the intruders.
4 blasts.
If you say so.
However, once they made it to the top, the Vikings were gone once again. To Ethelwulf's disbelief, the Vikings reappeared behind them. Ethelwulf was furious that as the commander of the 3 armies, he was being made a monkey out of by these barbarians. In frustration, Ethelwulf decided to destroy the Vikings' lifeline. Their ships, the boats, were crucial to the Vikings, and if they were destroyed, victory would be assured. So Ethelwulf directed his attention towards the Repton coast, disregarding the Vikings behind him.
To Repton, I imagine.
Oh, you crippled bastard! You were right! You were right! Oh, you bloody mad genius! You were right!
Little did he know, this was all part of Ivar's plan. Floki had been right. Ivar was indeed a military genius. In the past, the Vikings simply relied on their size and employed shield walls for face-to-face combat. However, in his first battle, Ivar chose to study military tactics instead of using the famous shield wall. In a valley between 2 hills, another portion of the Viking forces suddenly appeared on a hilltop, leaving Ethelwulf disoriented. Bjorn and the Harald brothers led a force to block the entrance, effectively trapping Ethelwulf's men. Ethelwulf's heart was burning as he looked at the shield wall on the other side, and then at his own tired troops, but they were out of options and he was forced to order a full assault with the intention of breaking through the enemy line with their numerical advantage. Ethelwulf and Bjorn began to engage in direct combat. Cold War is like a manual meat grinder, where the fists hit the flesh and the knives see blood. Although the English had a numerical advantage, their morale was nowhere near that of the Vikings, especially having been exhausted from the earlier chase. Ethelwulf took a moment to assess the situation and realized that if they continued in this manner, they would be annihilated. Moreover, Ivar and Floki were leading another force towards them. With no other choice, Ethelwulf bit the bullet, ordered his men to protect themselves, and led the remaining troops in a hectic retreat. Despite their numerical advantage, the English ended up suffering a heavy defeat. The Vikings began to cheer and celebrate, but Bjorn reminded his brothers that they had not yet truly succeeded.
What are you so happy about? It is not over yet.
Bjorn knew that their father's name would only be avenged once they had seized the capital of Wessex and slain Egbert. Ethelwulf, defeated, retreated back to Wessex in England with his remaining troops and immediately reported the disastrous news to Egbert, advising everyone to pack and flee. Ethelwulf knew well that the Vikings would not simply retreat, but instead would bring a significant force to attack the capital city. Yet Egbert had no intention of leaving, which puzzled Ethelwulf, as his father was a king and couldn't fall into the hands of the Vikings. In fact, Egbert did not leave after careful consideration. He knew that Viking's target is himself. If he followed the departure of the Vikings will certainly be in hot pursuit, and then the entire capital city fleeing the people will have to be buried with them.
I will renounce the crown in your favor. We'll have a short ceremony. Quick, go fetch Bishop Edmund.
Ethelwulf could not understand his father's thinking, but Egbert said it was God's will, so he reluctantly accepted the dispensable throne. What he didn't know was that Egbert was willing to die to save the fate of all of England. Soon after, under Bishop Edmund's authorization, Ethelwulf was formally crowned the lawful king of Wessex and Mercia. Following the brief ceremony, the new king, Ethelwulf, ordered everyone in the city to evacuate Wessex. No longer a king, Egbert bid farewell to his grandchildren, and Edmund also decided to stay with Egbert. for it was the land they had strived for their entire lives. After everyone left, Egbert and Edmund sat calmly in the wine cellar sipping wine while waiting for the judgment of fate. The Viking army arrived swiftly. Bjorn suspected that Egbert had some tricks up his sleeve, so when facing this small fortress, they deployed siege weapons. To their surprise, upon entering the city, they found it completely deserted. Fearing a trap, the Vikings became alert of possible ambushes. However, after a thorough search, they found no one, and realized that the English had abandoned the city. They began to shout like wild wolves, looting valuable items in the city, and anything they couldn't carry was set on fire. Egbert was still drinking in the cellar, but he never saw Vikings find him, so Egbert stumbled out.
Stop!
It was now Egbert's turn to be confined in a cage. The sons of Ragnar began to discuss what should be done with the old man. Ivar hoped for Egbert to suffer the blood eagle sentence, considering that prior to his death, Ragnar stressed that Egbert must pay a bloody price for the settlement's destruction. However, Bjorn had a differing opinion. He wanted to carry on his father's legacy and establish a larger settlement in Wessex. If Egbert was to undergo the blood eagle sentence, the English would certainly muster an army for revenge. As the brothers argued, Egbert offered his opinion.
We can make a new deal.
What are you proposing?
Well, as you say, it's only a matter of time before you're driven away from here. Without any legal right to English lands, you have no hope of staying. And I can give you that legal right. Because I am king, no one can question that claim. And it seems that you have enough men to enforce it until it holds.
Egbert emphasized that he was the king over this land of England. If they desired to establish a settlement here, it must possess legitimacy. He could grant them this legitimacy, enabling them to rightfully thrive on this land. The offer piqued their interests. Bjorn later sought out Ivar individually to inquire of his thoughts. Ivar felt that they should claim the land, but Egbert must meet his end through the blood eagle sentence. Bjorn didn't say a word. He approached Egbert once more and accepted Egbert's land proposition.
I accept your offer of land, but for what you did to my father, you must die.
Egbert had no intention of living, or he and his son would have run away, and he offered his own terms, which were to decide how he would die. After contemplating, Bjorn agreed. In the presence of a monk, Egbert signed the document authorizing the Vikings' legal rights to East Anglia, sealed with a stamp. Unbeknownst to the five brothers, Egbert was no longer king, which meant that his authorization had no real effect, and that this was the last scheme that Egbert had devised with his life. Once arrangements were completed, Egbert visited his beloved bathhouse to walk the last path of his life. After winning the war, the Vikings held extravagant celebrations on England's soil. With their vengeance fulfilled, discussions began regarding future plans. Bjorn advocated for his brothers to establish settlements in East Anglia to multiply and flourish, and he's still aiming for Rome. Therefore, Bjorn wished to complete his unfinished voyage in the Mediterranean, with half of the people choosing to accompany him. However, Ivar didn't desire farming. He sought to continue the battle with England, ever expanding his horizons until all of England became a part of his territory. Commenting, "Could you, a cripple, really lead an army? You're not even a real man." Ivar was incensed by the remark. Publicly shamed, he lost all reason and, in fury, threw an axe at Sigurd. Everyone was stunned. A son of Ragnar had killed another son of Ragnar. Sigurd's snake eyes were fixed on Ivar until his death. Ivar sobered up, but it was too late. Death is irreversible. This event sets up a break between several brothers in Season 5.